My name is Mike Kamber. I'm the director of the Bronx Documentary Center. And this evening we'll be speaking with Victor J. Blue live from Afghanistan. I want to warn everybody ahead of time that his internet is not great and it may drop at some point. So there may be some connection issues we're gonna have to deal with, but we'll work through that and he'll get back on. Behind me, I have our exhibition. It's called Urgency Afghanistan. It will be up through November 14th. It's the work of 15 photographers, American, European, a lot of Afghan photographers in the show, as well as multimedia and slideshows and voices of photographers. So again, please come visit. It's up until November 14th and it'll be open Thursday through Sunday in the afternoons. You can check bronxdoc.org for more information about that. The Bronx Documentary Center is a nonprofit here in the South Bronx. We are devoted to photography and photojournalism, particularly, and documentary work. So we're thrilled to have this evening's event, and I want to get started with you, Victor. Victor's an old friend of the BDC. He's exhibited here many times. He's come by and taught so many classes I can't remember, and worked with our students here and our teenagers and adults as well. So it's great to have you back, Victor.
Thanks, Mike. I'm glad to be here. Excited to see you and excited to talk to folks, back in the States and well, hopefully all over the world about what in the world has been going on in Afghanistan.
Yeah. You've been covering the war for many, many years, so you've got a lot of perspective on it, but I'd actually like to start with just the most recent stuff. I mean, I was here with you when you said, I'm going to go back to Afghanistan. I think that was about, 6-8 weeks ago. And, you were making plans and getting a visa and getting everything in. And it seems like you got in there just as things fell apart. Can you tell us what the experience was like? What your impressions are?
Yeah. Like you're saying, this summer, I started preparing to return to Afghanistan. This is my 7th reporting trip here since 2009. I was put in, I think a lot of journalists who cover the story, who don't live here, who have a stake in Afghanistan, personal or otherwise, kind of felt like, it's time. Like, I kind of felt like, wow, if I don't go now, this could be my last, I could miss it. This might be my last opportunity to get in for a long time. We all saw what direction it looked like the country was heading. And so I started making preparations. I think I landed in Afghanistan a little later than I wanted to. So it was like July 11th and spent the first few weeks kind of trying to, get my bearings. It was really slow. There were things happening in the provinces and there was fighting in the provinces, and I was frustrated that I wasn't making it out there yet. And then at the beginning of August, things started to happen really fast. It became clear. It was clear to me pretty soon after I landed what direction it was going to go. But in the end, it happened so rapidly and so in such a manner that no one anticipated, like no journalists, the Afghan government certainly didn't. And even the Taliban did not anticipate that it would go as fast as it did and as kind of bloodlessly as it did. There were heavy fights throughout the summer in kind of the typical areas, in the south and Helmand and Kandahar. And then also in the north, which was historically like a little bit of a different dynamic, because at the Taliban, their strategy was unbelievably successful and they swept through the north of the country and were able to squeeze off Kabul, cause a panic. And then on August 15th, they drove into Kabul and took the reins of the government. So it was historically unprecedented. It was professionally fluid and complicated and also unprecedented kind of thing to witness.
Can you tell us about that day, Victor? What you saw and what you remember? It must have been extraordinary.
It was an extraordinary day. So it was August 6th that the first provincial capital, Zaranj, the capital of Nimruz province, far in the west of Afghanistan, close to Iran, fell. And I don't think that many of us really kind of anticipated that would be the first one that would fall to the Taliban. And then every day after that, it was like dominoes, like one after another. like provincial or like a state capital would fall. And it was just marching closer and closer to Kabul. So, people started to evacuate. The major publications started to evacuate their staffs. And then on August 15th, I was here at the house. My good friend Andrew Quilty, who I live with here, who's an amazing photographer, and he and I have kind of like surfed through this whole experience. We woke up on August 15th, and it was not super early in the morning. It was kind of a normal, quiet morning. And then about mid-morning or a little before that, probably, we started to hear from inside the house we live in, from over the walls. We heard the panic start, and it got really loud. Like the traffic was loud, the shouting was loud, horns were honking. And so we grabbed the cameras and jumped on a motorbike, and went out to go see what we could see. And we pulled out into the town, and it was just pandemonium. Like the streets were clogged with traffic. The people were like running or walking quickly away from home or wherever they were trying to go. They were trying to get out of the central area of the city. It was just pandemonium. It was hard to move anywhere. Like even on a motorbike, we kept getting stuck in traffic. And we pulled up to, the photo just went by a few minutes ago, but we pulled up to Massoud Circle, which is directly in front of the U.S. Embassy. And we saw the Chinook helicopters, the U.S. military helicopters, airlifting people out of the embassy to the airport. And we just kind of stood there for a minute in awe, like, oh my God, that's the one right there. Yeah. When we were sitting there watching the Chinooks, I'll never forget. It's kind of a bummer because in the photograph, you can't really tell, but like, it looks so much different when you're standing there. But we were standing about where I took that photograph, and we watched one of the Chinooks just lift off over that wall. And they're big, powerful, loud helicopters. And I just remember seeing the two pilots sitting there kind of like look right at us and go right over us. And I just thought, it's over. The war is over. Like the U.S. adventure in Afghanistan is over. Like this is it. So things started to get a little disquieting on the street. It started to get a little weird, a little sketchy to be out on the street. So we rode around. We tried to get to the airport early on, like within the first hours, right after I took that photograph. It was impossible to get to the airport. The traffic was so backed up. So we made a couple loops around town, and we went back to the house. And at that point, we were like really unsure. We knew what was happening. We were just really unsure how it was going to go and what we were going to be able to do, if we were going to even be safe to stay in this house, like what the situation was. So we started making some preparations, and we spent like a couple of middle afternoon hours preparing. We like packed go bag. We already had go bags sort of packed, but we packed like, stuff we needed, hard drives, like whatever we had to take with us. We got ready to move to a safer location. And then after, we were trying to figure out a bunch of really complicated things here at the house that Quilty has to deal with because he runs his house. It's his home, and then we kind of, right before we were going to make a move, we kind of stuck our heads out, and we were like, it seems kind of quiet. So we went out onto the street and looked around and thought, okay, the panic has subsided. There was no one out, no cars, no pedestrians, nothing. And so we jumped back on the motorbike.
Afghan military?
No, we didn't see anybody. And we didn't really know what was going on. No one really knew at that point. There was rumors, but and we're like checking Twitter and everything. But so we jumped on the motorbike again, and we started riding around town, and the light was getting really nice out. And we made a couple circles around kind of downtown. We didn't see much. We didn't see much movement. There wasn't like big columns of Talibs coming into town yet. And then we were kind of getting ready to wrap it up, and we were riding along. We went past the Ministry of Defense, and then we were kind of riding around the river for a minute, along the river. And then we headed up this road, and we saw a small crowd of people gathering on the side of the road. And we thought, let's check that out. And we pulled up, and there were two Talibs sitting on a motorbike, holding weapons, wearing wraparound shades. And it was just such a revelatory moment. It was like, they're here, like, this is it. And, like those were the first, I had never had the experience of embedding with Taliban forces or covering Taliban forces. All my embed experience had been with US or Afghan forces of various, really all stripes. I'd photographed detained Talibs before, people who had been wrapped up in operations that I was on, but I'd never stood face to face with these guys who just won the war, who beat the biggest, most powerful military in the world. And we were like, we got off the bike and we were like, the crowd of people was like taking selfies with them. And so we were like, can we take some photos? And they were like, yeah, sure, no problem. And so we just started taking pictures of these guys, and they kind of sat there for a minute and they're kind of like talked to some of the people in the crowd, and the crowd was all like, patting them on the back and telling them congratulations. And then they kind of sped off, and we were like, oh man, we got to follow these guys. So we jumped on our motorbike and took off after them, and barreled down the street, and then just ran headlong into a column of Talib fighters from Wardak, a nearby province that's been a Taliban kind of base of support for decades now. And there was an American Humvee driving through the crowd at an area of town called Kodi Sengi. It's a big kind of crossroads in town. And, there were, I don't know, 12, 15 Talibs on this Humvee riding through, holding their weapons. And the crowds were coming out and cheering these guys. And then there were also guys walking through the crowd, trying to, move traffic around, guys on motorbikes. And we were just in the middle of it. And it was one of the most intense, surreal, like historically just overwhelming moments of my life, and they were, absolutely cool with us. They were like, hey, what's up? They weren't aggressive at all. And the Talibs had made an announcement by that point that they weren't going to enter the city. We know now from the reporting everyone's done that they didn't have any choice. They were forced to enter the city. And so, but these guys were just kind of on like a victory lap. It's kind of like if the Yankees had won the World Series and people like made a circle around the Bronx to celebrate. They came in, they celebrated, and then almost as quick as we had run into them, they kind of pulled out into the main road and just gunned it, and they just hightailed it back to Wardak. And Quilty and I were just overwhelmed, just flummoxed. Like, what did we just see? Like, what just happened? So we came home, filed the pictures. That night we had kind of the desire to get out and see what was going on. But to be honest, like everything was still so fluid, and we had no idea what was going to happen yet. It wasn't even yet completely clear there was going to be absolutely no fight for the city. So we kind of stuck it close to home that night. And then early the next morning, I remember I woke up super early, and because it happens that the house we live in, that I'm living here, Andrew Quilty's house where I'm renting a room, is close to a UN compound. And so this house benefits from a kind of security infrastructure. Like there's a gate here, and it used to be manned by Afghan National Police as well as private guards. And they have like, dogs and all that stuff to monitor people trying to get into the UN compound. So we have to go through that gate all the time. And so we woke up in the morning, and I got Quilty up early, like probably a little before 7. And I said, I think we should go meet our new Taliban guards. And so we went out, we got up, and we were kind of like, oh man, what do we do? How do we go talk? What do we say to the Taliban? And we were like, oh, we should bring them something. And I was like, okay, there's a garden here at the house. I was like, let's bring him some fresh tomatoes. And Quilty was like, nah, man, that's not a thing in Afghanistan. Nobody brings anybody fresh tomatoes. Like, nobody cares. That's not going to be a thing. And I was like, all right. And then he was like, let's bring him some figs. So we like picked this bag of figs from the fig tree here, and we walked outside, and just a few steps outside the door was a great big, American-made Humvee that was now a Taliban Humvee, and a Taliban commander named Mullah Haidari. And he was standing there with like 2 or 3 of his guys, and the entire group of our Afghan National Police guards with no weapons were standing in front of them, kind of like looking at us and nodding, like, this is the Taliban. They're here. This is the Taliban. You come meet them. And so, yeah, we introduced ourselves. They were not impressed with our bag of figs. And we said, hello, how's it going? We live in this house here. Hopefully it's going to be fine. Our neighbors were out there who we know here, and we're talking to them, and they were definitely a little frosty. They were definitely a little like reserved, a little guarded, but we, said hi, explained who we were, what we were doing here. And they said, okay, no problem. And then we just they replaced that. We never saw the Afghan National Police again. They, I assume, tossed their uniforms and went home. And from now on, ever since August 16th, we've had a whole cohort of Taliban guards at our front gate every day that we see as we come and go multiple times a day. We wave to them, and we interact with them all the time. We actually have the commander who's in charge out there right now. They've changed a couple of times, but he's a real nice guy and seems on the up and up. He's been really good to us. So that's how it went down initially. And then ever since then, it's just been, obviously for the first few weeks, it was a lot of the first few days, it was busy, and we were trying to get a handle on what was going on, and we were running around Kabul trying to take pictures of Talibs and interact with folks and meet folks, and that was intense. And then it was like the next day or the day after. It started before, but then the whole airport situation kind of became an overwhelming and sort of like a center of gravity, or really kind of a black hole here in Kabul. And so we started trying to cover that as well, which was just unbelievable, just a disaster, an absolute disaster all the way around. It was very frustrating to watch and very frustrating to cover. And so then we kind of, you were kind of transitioning into that, and it was a tough, situation, because the thing that was hard to communicate to people, it's like you would make a trip to the airport, try to go photograph the airport. It was unbelievably chaotic, unbelievably dangerous. I did very poorly out there. I only got a few pictures. It was super hard. I went multiple times. I got no pictures. It was like, it was just an impossible situation.
Because there was a sea of people, or you couldn't get through, or was somebody blocking you from photographing?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, all of the above. Yeah, the crowds were. Afghanistan its crowds can be dangerous in Afghanistan. We know over the years, big crowds here can be unpredictable. They can be dangerous, and so there were just crowds of thousands of people swarming around the gates of the airport, and then you have the Talibs trying to control those crowds and having no experience in crowd control, no tools for crowd control at all. So the only tool they had for crowd control was to fire their weapons in the air. So they were just firing off hundreds of rounds constantly into the air, and then sometimes not all into the air, sometimes into the crowds and killing folks. And we also have to remember that the U.S. Marines were also shooting into the crowds and killing people as well. I think the Marines killed at least as many Talibs in the early days as not Talibs, killed at least as many Afghans in the early days as the Talibs did. Most of it on accident, some of it not. They felt threatened and felt like they had to shoot into the crowd to stop the crowds from moving on top of them. But yeah, and then of course the Talibs did stop you from photographing. The situation, they knew the situation was chaotic. It didn't look good. Sometimes you would get lucky and talk to a commander who would be like, okay, you can take some pictures here, but we had some nasty run-ins with Talibs who, and I didn't blame them then, and I don't blame them now, who were in an absolutely impossible situation and a dangerous situation for them as well too. But the last thing they were worried about was an American photographer trying to take some pictures of how bad things were for them. So yeah, it was super tough. It was really difficult. But the dichotomy, the strange dichotomy, was that the airport was such a chaotic scene, and everybody was so taken with the images and the video that we saw of the C-17 taken off with the people clinging to the landing gear and the chaos, at the airport gates over the walls, and the Talibs beating back the crowds. But it really obscured the fact that all of Kabul was absolutely at peace. It was absolutely quiet in the city. There was a few reports of looting the first couple of days, and then the Talibs shut that down super fast. There was no real looting. Street crime absolutely disappeared. And the Talibs were busying themselves with trying to fill in the security apparatus that had been abandoned, evacuated by the Afghan government. They had a really tall order and a tough job to do, and they did it remarkably well. There was not a shot fired in anger to take the biggest city in Afghanistan after 20 years of war. It was insane. So it was hard to communicate to folks the peace that had descended on the country when they were watching the images from the airport at home of the absolute chaos and death there. So that was a hard thing to kind of communicate and try to wrap your mind around too.
It's interesting because one of the things that people talked about in the 1990s when the Taliban were coming to power was that in many areas they were welcomed because they ended the chaos and they ended the fighting. And it sounds like you're saying something similar now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the hard things too is that it's hard, and it's even hard for me, even being here, is that there's a real dichotomy in Afghanistan between there's a real urban rural divide. Afghanistan is one of the only countries in the world that's a majority rural country still. I think it's 60% of the Afghan population is estimated to live in the countryside, not in cities. So it can be difficult sometimes to, like, the view from Kabul can be so different from the view from the districts. But I mean, the Taliban have controlled much of this country for a couple of years now, and they controlled almost all of the country by late summer. So they controlled the districts, they controlled the provinces, they controlled the kind of like rural heartland of the country, and had been implementing their government for a long time. And it's true, like, it's one of the hard things for people to understand. It's one of the things that the U.S. project here never understood. But if you went out and covered the districts, if you went out and not just did covered military operations, but if you went and did stories in the districts over the last few years, it was clear. I mean, I would always be seized with the impression, like, man, I mean, I know the Talibs are supposed to be bad, but can they be that much worse than this government? Like, that it was so riddled with corruption, that was so compromised by human rights violations, by warlordism, and so, yeah, like, lots of areas of the country have embraced the Taliban and were ready for the Taliban to relieve them from the previous order. Certainly not all of it, certainly not folks who benefited from the previous order and who now are in a very difficult situation and kind of shut out because of the coming of the Taliban. But there are wide swaths of the country and wide swaths of society who have embraced the new regime, the new order.
But certainly not many women.
Well, that's a complicated question. Definitely not many women, and definitely not many urban women. Like, look, the ascension of the Taliban is an unmitigated disaster for women's rights in Afghanistan. Now, that said, there are conservative Afghan women, like, I mean, some of the pictures on display in this talk, and it was a kind of a big news story, was a kind of, fake protest the Taliban put on by women who were covered in a kind of like very ultra conservative and really foreign to Afghanistan sort of outfit, like an extreme niqab and chador. We did interview, one of our New York Times colleagues interviewed one of those women, and she was a teacher at a female madrasa here in town. So it's not like, there was like some fake pictures, like people Photoshop men's faces into some of them and stuff. And people were like, oh, they dressed up men to look like women who support the Taliban. That just wasn't true. There are conservative Afghan women, but I mean, the truth is that, the return of the Taliban is a disaster for women's rights in Afghanistan. And that's a complicated thing for Westerners, especially Americans, right? Is like the education of women and the promotion of women's rights in Afghanistan was like a hallmark of our 20-year war here, and oftentimes used in a very duplicitous way as a justification for that war. And one of the things that was hard to wrap your mind around was like, okay, yeah, the prospects for women being educated, for women having an equal place in society with men, for the prospects for women to work in public life, to even have a public life, are definitely circumscribed now. Like, it's a disaster. But if you're a rural Afghan woman, like, one of the biggest impediments to you exercising your rights was the war, was like constantly losing your family members, was being, having your family members killed in drone strikes, or your family members killed in night raids. That as well was a disaster for Afghan women. So it's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's a complicated thing for sure. But yeah, we've been really covering and being on top of what this change means for Afghan women, and it's not good. It's really bad.
Mm-hmm. They've already kept them out of Kabul University, and you anticipate that that's going to spread across the country, or they're going to keep women from schooling?
Well, so I did a story about this. I did a story about the education of Afghan girls with my colleague, the amazing David Zucchino, who just won the Pulitzer Prize this year. He's an amazing guy. And so I reported this out over the course of for a lot of days, over a couple of weeks. And so what happened was, for the first week after the Taliban took control, they closed kind of all the schools, and then they allowed all school children to return to school from first to the 6th grade, boys and girls. And here in Afghanistan, education is generally co-educational in grades 1, 2, 3, and then after grade 4, they're separated into separate classes. And they didn't allow anyone to come back to school, high school, boys or girls, for about a month. From grades 7 to 12. And then on Friday, about 2 weeks ago, they issued an order that the next day they were going to allow only boys back to school, and which is effectively a ban on girls' secondary education in Afghanistan. And, we were all very concerned about this. It's a terrible turn of events. I had already been reporting the story and talking to people in schools and talking to students at that point. So then we kind of circled back with people and asked them what they thought about, because when I was reporting the story, it was kind of like, well, what are they going to do? What's going to happen? And then we saw what they were going to do. Now, we reached out to the Taliban. Their justification is that they are working to create an Islamic system. They're working to, they're definitely going to segregate boys and girls. They're definitely going to, the teachers are going to be only female teachers for women students. And they say they're trying to set up some kind of transportation system. It's hard to say who buys. I don't think anybody really buys this. Like, this is what they did in the 1990s when they took power before, and it resulted in a de facto ban on women's education. Like, women were still able to draw their salaries. Female teachers still drew their salaries, but they were never allowed back in the classroom to teach. And this is the $64 million question, right? This is the thing we're all trying to figure out. Is this the same Taliban as the 1990s, or is this a new Taliban? And I honestly think that question sort of misses the mark a little bit, but we're all trying to figure this out. How far are they going to go? What are they going to do? So they say that once they get this all set up, they're going to let female high school students return to class. They've said this over and over again. I haven't seen any evidence that that's the case yet. But then again, it's weird for them to break their word on something like that they've doubled down on multiple times. I also think one of the hard things to understand is that the movement is not, while it's very cohesive, it's not monolithic. And we know that there are different strains within the movement. We know that there are folks who have different outlooks and that are pushing for different things and different levels of conservative and a different vision for what they want this government to look like. And so I think
they're also desperate for foreign aid and recognition.
Exactly. I mean, we just saw yesterday, Qatar came out and criticized Qatar. The Qataris have been the Taliban's #1 facilitator and friend so far. And we saw yesterday that the Qataris came out and criticized the Taliban openly, saying that they need to be educating their girls. And if they want to see an Islamic system, they should look to Qatar, which I thought was a very interesting point. And a lot of countries have talked about withholding recognition of the Taliban until they do this. So they do want it. They say they're going to do it. We're not going to trust them until they do allow women back into classrooms, and if they do, we'll report on it. And if they continue to ban them, we'll report on that too. It's just hard to say right now, but of course it's a disaster for women, for young girls who have now, after a year of Corona, after missing so much education, young gals who are at home right now, who are terrified about their future, who can't concentrate, who can't study. It's a disaster for them. It really is. And we're trying to stay on top of it.
Did you think the evacuation, what could have been done differently? Is it simply a matter of doing it earlier, or can you talk about that? Do you have a sense of what the U.S. could have done better to avoid leaving all those folks behind? Because there are a lot of folks that never got out. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know where to start with the evacuation, and I'll make a couple comments about it. But it's I mean, as I said before, it was an absolute disaster all the way around. I think that the first problem with the evacuation is that, and we'll talk about this a little more later, I think, but a part of the first problem with it was that everybody was looking at this moment and looking at the Taliban through a lens that no longer makes any sense and that no longer applies. And that's a lens of a kind of global war on terror, 9/11, these are our enemies kind of lens. And that kind of informed, I think, people's reaction to the takeover of the Taliban. Like people panicked, you know, people panicked, and there was a sense that if you didn't get every person who had any connection to the West out of Afghanistan, that they'd be murdered in their beds. And the honest truth, and we are on top of this every day, is that there has been no widespread campaign of reprisal against former, people who worked with journalists, people who worked with the US, people who worked with even, the Taliban announced a blanket amnesty of all of the Afghan national forces and everyone who worked with the foreigners. Now, there are revenge killings happening. There are people settling scores. There are people looking for people. Like that is happening. But there's no why the Taliban are not directing a campaign of reprisal against these people. And so people in the West tended to see this as like the last chance. If we don't get these people out, they're going to be killed by the Taliban, which just frankly, except there's a small number of people who are in danger, who are vulnerable, who needed to be prioritized. And there was no one prioritizing those people. It was literally whoever could fight their way past the Talibs and past the Marines would get tossed onto a C-17 and flown out. I mean, it was honestly, I felt shame watching the evacuation, the way it happened. This administration was absolutely remiss. Absolutely. It was an absolute disaster on their part, and especially on the part of the CIA and the US military as well. I mean, the CIA flew out hundreds of members of their hunter-killer teams, of their counterterrorism pursuit teams, that don't have SIV status, that were fighters, that were off-the-books fighters for the CIA, that committed, almost nearly uncounted human rights violations around the country. Those folks are all now been repatriated to the United States. I watched one night at the airport gate in the middle of the night, dozens of their trucks drive through the gates while desperate Afghans were kept outside. We know that tens of thousands of SIV applicants who earned through their work with the United States, who earned a place in the US, were left here, and they prioritized folks who, in my opinion, have not earned that place. So, it was a disaster the way around. And then a panic kind of set in about it. And, we were covering it. I was also involved in some of the evacuation stuff. I was involved in trying to get folks out. And it was important to, there were folks that needed to get out, and folks that wanted to get out, and folks who had earned through the hard work they'd done and the risks they'd run over the years to help the US project here get out. That needed to happen. I'm glad for a lot of that. But overall, the panic of it and the panic around the Taliban takeover, look, I mean, a lot of these folks do not want to live in a theocracy, in a extremely conservative Islamist state. And I get that, but this kind of psychotic panic that, of course, I read.
Not necessarily with the Taliban, but in other places. I mean, you and I have both covered a lot of stuff where there have been, widespread reprisals and revenge killings and such. So, but I totally take your point, that, and it's good that it hasn't happened. And I'm also really glad, and I know Stephanie Sinclair and Andrea Bruce and just Paula Bronstein and a whole bunch of photographers have really stepped forward and created a big campaign to get folks out that deserve to be out and that had helped photographers and journalists over the years.
Yeah, totally. And I get that. I think that's true.
Yeah.
It's like I said, I think that kind of broadly speaking, there was this absolute, again, it was a panic at what the coming of the Taliban meant, and I think that people who kind of, look, over my years of work in Afghanistan, I have really been lucky. I've benefited from friendships I made and from intellectual relationships I've made with a certain a group of people who really understood this place and understood how to explain it, and did not look at it through this lens of the U.S. project here, right? Like people like Bette Dam, the Dutch journalist, Anand Gopal, Matt Akins, Felix Kuhn, people who, Graham Smith, the great Canadian journalist, like these are people who I made friends with, who I learned from. And I think that prepared me for this moment to be able to not just be able to stay and kind of navigate the moment, but also to kind of understand what was happening. And so I was watching, I was on the phone with lots of people who were like, we got to get people out. What can we do? And I would just tell people, look, right now, the best thing to do is to stay home, and the airport is completely dangerous. It's absolute chaos. I think the best thing to do is stay home and kind of see where this goes, because it was too dangerous to be dragging people to the airport. It was absolute, right. It was crazy. It was chaotic.
Sure. I just want to read a couple of messages. You got a couple of shout outs from home, from North Carolina, here, and which I'll send you. We've got one that says, I'm a veteran and a documentary photographer who served in Afghanistan in 2010 and thankfully managed to get one of my Afghan friends and his family out. They're currently on a base in New Jersey. And that is that's from Anthony. And then LB, I echo John, thank you for the work you do. I wish more people could hear these stories. It's incredible for people to hear the reality of what's taking place and not just the heavily curated stories by our Western media. Really appreciate what you're sharing. The images are so incredibly powerful. Jennifer says,
I appreciate that.
In the scope of things, do you agree that this would rank with, the French defeat in Algeria, Indochina, the Vietnam, the Americans fleeing Vietnam, and this is going to go down in the history books. I can't imagine. I can't imagine another world power spending 20 years and literally trillions of dollars and watching the whole thing collapse in 2 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to reply real quick, hey, Jennifer, no matter what, I appreciate that. And John or LB, thanks. Look, I appreciate the shout out. Let's remember, I do work for the Western media. Like I've been fortunate since I've been here to work for two of the biggest Western publications there are, who both dedicated decades to covering the story in Afghanistan. So, let's not paint too broad a brush here, or if anybody's guilty, I'm guilty as well. But yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know. What do you think? Can we imagine a situation? This is an absolute abject failure of the United States, of our country, right? Like the project in Afghanistan, the global war on terror, hunting for enemies around the world was always premised on a lie. It was always premised on a false set of assumptions, of false politics, and those chickens came home to roost. The bottom line is the fact that it's hard for people to kind of fathom is that Afghanistan is at peace. The country is at peace. Like every day until August 15th, hundreds of people lost their lives in this war, a war that Americans had stopped paying attention to. I don't know how many years ago, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, more. Like no one was paying attention, and Afghan people were dying left and right. Every day, hundreds. And since August 15th, there's been zero. Like no one is being killed on the battlefield. Okay, for a little while there was a fight in Panjshir. A kind of rump resistance movement formed in Panjshir and was fighting back, and there was fighting there. There's been some fighting with Daesh, but nothing on the scale of the 20-year American project here. And the bottom line is that I see a lot of debate about this.
No more drone strikes. No more. Yeah.
Well,
no more night raids.
But we can talk about that too. The two Biden administration drone strikes right in the final days. My colleagues Matt Akins and Jim Hollebrook forced the Pentagon to admit that they had killed innocent people, that they didn't know who that they had lied, that they had not targeted an ISIS facilitator,
Right.
they had not targeted a car bomb. And,
Yeah.
you know, for those of us who've covered this story for over a decade now, like, we know, like, the only reason that happened was because that strike was in Kabul, and we could drive out and drive to their house and talk to the victims. But there are uncountable drone strikes in this country that have happened over the last 2 decades in our name that have killed innocent Afghans in identical circumstances. And no one ever checks up on it because it's in too remote an area, it's too dangerous to get there, or no one really cares. And that's, you know, that's an embarrassment. That's a stain on it. So I think, to get back to your question, I think this is an unprecedented moment.
Yeah, it's extraordinary that the very last military action that the U.S. took after 20 years, at the end of 20 years, was to kill a family accidentally and then lie about it.
I mean, I don't even know. I mean, yeah, I mean, I guess accidentally. I mean, you know, honestly, I'm a little curious about accidental. It really was too. And then they came out and admitted a couple of days ago that the drone strike 2 days before that in Nangarhar province, way in the east, also was struck. They said a couple of ISIS guys in a car that had nothing to do with the airport bombing. So, you know, I mean, anyway, I think it's not extraordinary, actually. I mean, I agree with you. It seems extraordinary, but it's also emblematic. I mean, the last military action here was to kill innocent people. The last military action after our 20-year war. After a 20-year war that, honestly, I see a lot of debate about this in the news. And it's funny to me to watch some of the folks that get recycled on the news programs or even in publications I respect. You know, there's a big David Petraeus interview in the New Yorker about what went wrong. I was like, what are you, crazy? Why are you asking David Petraeus what went wrong? He lost this war. The US military, the biggest military in the world, lost the war to these guys on screen right now.
Okay, but hold on a second. You yourself, you know, and you and I both spent, you know, a lot of time out in the field, you know, with U.S. soldiers that I think were giving their heart and soul and trying to do the right thing out there. And you know, you in particular focused on COIN, on the counterinsurgency strategy of the U.S. military. And you know, you've told me, you know, how effective and how hardworking and how decent you found a lot of American soldiers there. Can you talk about what you feel lost the war for us?
Yeah, no question. I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the field, U.S. soldiers, a lot of who I've been in touch with, or a handful of a few I've been in touch with. I've gotten, you know, messages from them since I've been here, and we've been in touch on email. A couple I've tried to give advice to about getting their friends out of Afghanistan. Like, I love the time I spent with U.S. soldiers here, but U.S. soldiers were failed as well. And it wasn't their job on the ground to win the war in Afghanistan. The reason we lost the war in Afghanistan is because it was predicated on a set of beliefs, on a set of assumptions, and we were sold a set of lies. It was a house of cards, and that's why we lost this war. Is because the powers that be, successive Democrat and Republican administrations, bought into a set of lies. And the honest truth is that we just didn't care about Afghan people. We didn't care about the project here. It was all smoke and mirrors. And we were always allowed to play. We were always willing, not allowed. We were always willing to play with Afghan lives like they were playthings, like they were abstract. We were willing to expend any amount of Afghan life, you know, in order to further
Right.
our policy aims here.
Are you really being fair? Because, you know, we also spent, you know, trillions of U.S. tax dollars. Quite a few thousand of Americans died there, including a lot of contractors. You know, I mean, we stuck in there for 20 years. I mean, it's not like we, you know, I don't know. I mean, you make it sound like it was, you know, like, I don't know.
I mean, it's a hard realization.
I also think, you know, I hear a lot of people say, like, oh, there were lots of easy solutions and the U.S. just didn't do it. But I don't know what the easy solution was. Or do you think that we should have gone in and gotten out in 2001? You know?
Well, what I think the original, and you know, what I think the original sin in this war was that our politics, the politics of the global war on terror, made it impossible for us to get an honest read on the situation in Afghanistan. And so we went hunting for an enemy. The truth of the matter is that the Taliban surrendered right after 2001. The Taliban wanted to go home. Mullah Omar offered to surrender to the United States. and we attempted to kill him in a drone strike immediately afterwards. Like, we created this enemy because we needed an enemy in order to perpetuate this war. The Bonn conference that took place, in the years immediately after the fall of the Taliban, like, the organizers of the Bonn conference refused to allow the Taliban seat at the table, to refuse to allow them a place in the government. And it's interesting because, and that's where I think the original mistake happened, is that we didn't allow a reconciliation. We didn't allow the Taliban a place at the table, because the fact of the matter is they're an Afghan movement. They are an Afghan movement. They are not, they're not a foreign imposed kind of thing. The Taliban come from the hamlets and towns of this country. And by not allowing them to sit at the table, it's funny because the interesting thing to me right now is that it seems as though the Taliban is doing the exact same, making the same mistake now that the Western powers made in, what year was the Bonn conference? 03 or 04, one of those.
Yeah.
Or 2 or 3. So they're making the same mistake now, right? By not creating an inclusive government, by not allowing their former enemies into the government, not allowing people into the government who represent other segments of society that they don't represent. Right. They're creating the same dynamic, and they're going to have the same result. They're going to have the same unstable. They're not going to create a stable order here or regime here, because they're not allowing people to have political representation the same way that they didn't either back in the day. And look, the result is the result. Like, the bottom line is, like, General Miller flew out of here. What day was it? It was like early August. Like, the CENTCOM, or whoever the PAO folks organizing that, didn't allow any journalists to document an NBC camera crew happened to catch him getting on a helicopter. They didn't tell anybody at that meeting. There's a great story about this that was in the New Yorker, and Gordon Lubal, the Wall Street Journal reporter, caught it, that he, they like kind of had a goodbye ceremony, said, okay, goodbye. And then they rushed him on a helicopter and flew him out, like that was the end, like that. And I think it's hard for people to kind of give the Taliban credit, but at the end of the day, like 20 years, 20 years, they did it.
They did, yeah. It's extraordinary that they were able to regroup, and it's also extraordinary that it's a bunch of guys with old Russian, beat up Russian rifles and Shalwar Kameez, no artillery, no modern technology, no air force, no helicopters. And they were able to beat, really the most advanced army in the world by far.
Here's my hot take, Mike. Are you ready for this? You heard it here first, right? This is my hot take. I've been mulling this over a lot, and I'm going to get piled on for this. But before I came here, I was reading a little bit about the Vietnam War, and then I was thinking a lot about Afghanistan, and I think we're going to come to the realization that superior U.S. air power is actually losing our wars instead of winning them. I think that, the great work that Azmat Khan has done in Mosul and she's working on in Afghanistan as well. And Anand Gopal, the story he just wrote for the New Yorker about rural Afghan women, we're going to start to see that, the thing we're most proud of is our ability to deliver air support to drone strikes, 500-pound bombs, mother of all bombs. These things are losing wars for us, not winning them. That's my early take. You heard it here. Everybody pile on now.
Well, you did talk about working with a really effective, I think it was a Marine Corps unit, and they were actually calling off air support because they knew the air support would kill civilians and turn the civilians against them, which was an extraordinary thing. Yeah.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because my good buddy Matt Stuhler, who was the platoon, the PL platoon leader of that unit, is one of the people who really kind of informed my opinion about this stuff. Watching him operate, watching his guys operate. My good friend Manny Jimenez, who lost an arm on one of those operations with that unit, like, those guys fought courageously. They fought tough, and they bought in. They believed in the mission as it was told to them. And I admire them for that. The problem is that their military leaders were not good faith operators, operators in that calculus. And here's the result. And I know it's hard for those guys. I feel for them. Like, commiserate with them. It's hard to watch, this project fall to pieces. It's hard to watch so much investment in time and money and blood and lives go down the drain. It's very difficult. It's tough for me. But the problem is that if we only look at it through that lens or through one lens, it doesn't help us kind of see and understand this moment and understand who the Taliban are and what they're about and what it means that they won this war. I mean, you said, it's interesting. You said like, oh, well, you're right. They won with like minimal equipment, no technology. But it was funny today. I was with my good friend, Jim Holybrook, who I've been working with closely here. He's an amazing photographer, amazing journalist. He's been here working for the New York Times for years. And we were interviewing a Taliban commander in Wardak province, just down the way here. And we were, and last week also, I was hanging out with a Taliban unit and chatting with them. And they were explaining to me their setup, how they're organized. And I was like, man, the kind of the cohesion that these units have, like the kind of unit cohesion these guys have, like it's extra. Yeah, here's some of Jim's amazing pictures. He's been doing incredible work here for years.
But let me ask you a question, Vic. The Taliban fighters are drawn from the exact same group of fighters that filled the Afghan army, that we spent all these years and 350 billion, not million, but $350 billion training and arming that army. I mean, it's fascinating because I covered Iraq, and I remember getting to Iraq in 2003, and they were telling me, well, our plan, we're gonna get the Iraqi army up to speed, and they're gonna take over. And then when I went back the next year, they told me the same thing. And then in 2007, 2008, and it almost became a joke. We're gonna get the Iraqi army trained up. And then I think in 2012 or 13, I mean, the Iraqi army completely collapsed. At the sight of a handful of guys in pickup trucks, basically. And it's really kind of the same story in Afghanistan as it was in Iraq. So I'm curious, is it true that the Taliban fighters were basically made up of the same people that made up the Afghan army? I mean, not the same people, like literally the same people, but rural Afghans from the provinces, probably a lot of Pashtun.
That's certainly true. Like one thing, I've seen a lot of commentary kind of online and on Twitter and stuff about how, we paid all this money, 300,000 strong Afghan army, and they didn't want to fight. They refused to fight. They walked away. They ran away. They weren't implying somehow they weren't brave, that they were somehow compromised. And I just don't have any time for that analysis. That's the kind of stuff you hear watching Fox News. Like, that's just not true. It's just ridiculous. The truth of the matter is that most of this country was handed over bloodlessly. This year, like in the last few months, not all of it, most of it. We had the big tragic fights in Lashkar Gah and Helmand province, and then of course in Kandahar province, which took the life of the amazing photographer Danish Siddiqui, which was absolutely tragic, absolutely crushing. I was here in Kabul when he was killed, and we were devastated by that. And honestly, as a side note, just the experience of photographing the end of this war, which is really, it's been a really gratifying thing to photograph peace, to photograph the end of this war, even though the West, I guess, quote unquote, my country, lost it. Like, it's been gratifying to photograph this peace. I think I've thought a lot about Dinesh. I didn't know him. I'd never met him, but I was following his work very closely. And I've thought a lot about him, on some of the days where we've seen such extraordinary change here in Afghanistan. And really, it's heartbreaking that he was killed, like in some of the last engagements of the war, and never got to come and photograph this unbelievable change that we're all experiencing. But back to the Afghan forces. I mean, look, like we built an army in our own image. I don't know why anybody thought building an army in our own image, like, was going to beat a force that beat our army, look, I was here in 2009, 10, and 13 doing like weeks of embeds. And of course, like, if you put a US military trained unit with all the technology and all of everything that they carry with them, like head to head against the Taliban unit in the districts, like they're probably going to outshoot them. But that's not how we fight wars, right? We don't fight wars like, anybody who thinks that a war is won or lost by who shoots who in a dusty field doesn't understand war, right? And the truth is that the Afghan army we created was part and parcel of this failed U.S. vision from the start, and that's why they lost this war. Like they were never given there was never a chance that they were going to win this war, and now we saw with the retreat and the collapse of the Afghan government, how, the Afghan government had no real claim of sovereignty in this country. No one believed in that project. No one believed in the government of Ashraf Ghani. The United States, how do we expect them to? We engineered the election victory of the last 2 presidential elections in this country, right? They were corrupt, they were unfair, and our State Department went in and engineered the winner. Like we came up with a solution. We have one guy who won, and then another guy who didn't, but they're co-presidents or what. John Kerry came up with this. I mean, that's fine, but it's ridiculous for just to assume that was a stable kind of government or stable platform. It just was never the case.
Those are fascinating echoes of Vietnam in the early 60s. And
absolutely,
there's a great book called what's it called? The Great Shining Lie. Do you know that book?
A Great and Shining Lie, yeah. I think it's by Neil Sheehan.
Yeah, and you read it, and it so much of it echoes what's happened in Afghanistan. And I have a couple of comments here I just want to read real quick. One from says, Victor, you're spot on. I was in Paktika province, Sharan in the east, as well as Bagram. I commend you for the work. I had a quick question. Can you talk about the average amount of time you spend on a assignment, or does that vary?
It really varies. The weird thing is that, and it's been kind of hard for me to wrap my mind around, but it's been great, is that, previously, if I was going to run around Kabul and shoot some photos or do a photo assignment, we would do it very quickly, right? We'd be like low profile. We'd have a security plan. But at this point, this country's never been safer, especially for Western journalists. Like, we can get in a car. We got in a car last week or week before last and drove to Ghazni. I'd never been to Ghazni before. Ghazni was one of the most restive provinces, one of the Taliban strongholds. We just drove into the province, drove right past tons of Talibs, drove right past Taliban checkpoints. No one cares. Everybody's at peace. We did a great story about a village destroyed by fighting. So, I could spend a lot more time on photographing than I used to. I can walk through the markets, the crowded, chaotic markets in downtown Kabul without fear of, sometimes you run into a Talib that wants to know what the heck you're doing and you got to kind of talk your way out of it and whatever. But the vast majority of them, they have bigger fish to fry. They don't care about us. So it's hard for me to say exactly how much time I spend on an assignment. Some days I spend, like when we made a run to Panjshir to try to document the fighting there, or the end of the fighting there. We were there for, we left first light and came back at night. Sometimes I go out to shoot a portrait and it's just a couple of hours. I try to spend as much time as I can on assignments. It's also been very strange in that, we're operating in a way that is very different from how the New York Times has operated in Afghanistan in the past, and in a very different way than it operates in most places. Like the New York Times evacuated its entire staff. And there was no one here except for me, Matt, and Jim to work for the New York Times. So we kind of create a bit of an ad hoc bureau, and so I don't really have photo assignments in the way that I used to. Like Jim and I are generating a lot of the work, and we're in contact with a huge group of reporters and editors and oftentimes reporting out the stories that they're working on as well. And then also trying to shoot photographs for them. And we're also writing stories. Me less than Jim. Jim is writing a ton of amazing stories. So we're working in a little bit different way. So it's not like I get like an assignment brief in my email and then here's a contact and I go shoot it. It doesn't really work that way right now. It's a little bit more.
Right. No, that's a great help. Fascinating. Are there other questions, folks? If there's other questions, can you put them in the chat and we'll get to them here. We have a comment from John. Air power only helps ground troops win the war, which is something we spoke about a few minutes ago. Yeah, good point. Exactly. And we also from Anthony, I believe this is from Anthony, mentioning 75% of the country lives in rural areas. We didn't focus enough on those areas. We didn't spend enough time with the people. Exactly. We have from Laura, Vic, I'm struggling to understand peace when it took only 24 hours for the Taliban to put women back in bags. Is there anything any of us can do for them?
Well, that's a really good point. I would disagree a little bit with the characterization situation. Like the Taliban haven't put Afghan women necessarily yet back in bags. That was like a big thing. People kind of had a tough time understanding in that. We were driving around today and commenting that, Afghan women are on the street. Afghan women are out on the street. They're out living. I'm sure, I know for sure, I know from talking to them that they are afraid and uncertain of their future, but they are, you see, and they're not all wearing burqas. They're not all wearing niqabs. You see a lot of women out on the street, kind of similarly to that you did before the Taliban takeover. So Afghan women's lives are certain to be more circumscribed, but as of now, it's not as though they are like all imprisoned in their homes. Now, of course, we talked extensively about education, and that's a disaster. It's something that the West has to really put pressure on this new government to help the currents within the Taliban who are open to women's education, such as it will be, to help them achieve that. That's going to be really important. And you asked, like, what can we do for Afghan women? I think the best thing that we can do for Afghan women is not turn our backs on them. Like when the Taliban took this country in 1996, after we had funded the Mujahideen war against the Soviets for over a decade and successfully, our country turned our back on Afghanistan. No one cared about Afghan women's rights. No one in America, period. And so if people are at home and they're so concerned about Afghan women's rights, I would say the best thing you can do is not forget them, not turn your back on them, not forget, not let it go. Of course, like fundraising, supporting women's organizations in Afghanistan, I assume at some point there will be a movement, a kind of underground education movement will spring up. If you really care about Afghan women, like, get off Twitter, get off Facebook. And I'm sure if you're asking me this question, you already know a lot about it and you're already trying to get involved, but get involved, like spend your money. And I think in a broader sense, the thing that we can do is hold our leaders to account. No one wants to talk about the leaders. It's so easy to condemn leaders from the opposite party who made mistakes here, but it's a lot harder to look at the leaders from your own perspective, your own persuasion, your own political corner, and hold them to account for what happened in Afghanistan, because they are equally at fault. I can say that unequivocally. Barack Obama is just as at fault for the disaster in this country as George Bush or Donald Trump. And, yell at me all you want about that, but I challenge you to come up with a historical argument that contravenes that.
Mm-hmm. Right. We've got from JHT, he wanted to thank you for the coverage and the stories. His question is, for aspiring photojournalists looking to transition into the field in today's climate, what advice would you give for those of us starting out, or for photographers moving into photojournalism from other areas of photography?
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours. I have a lot of opinions about this or advice about it. My first opinion is get out and make pictures, start making pictures, make pictures every day. Find your own stories, find projects that you want to work on that you're going to commit to, and spend time with people in their lives, in their homes, and make pictures of them. Second, depending on where you're at in your life or your career, get a job in a newspaper. Well, I'm sorry, like, people don't want to hear that, but get a job in a newspaper. That's the best thing you can do. That's the best training ground you're ever going to have. I know newspapers are dying. They're dying fast. I know it's a low paid, sometimes not very glamorous job. I used to do a lot of pet of the week, but the truth is that, like, I can't do what I'm doing in Afghanistan if I can't do what I'm doing at a city hall meeting in Stockton, California, where I used to be a newspaper staff photographer. If you can't make great, interesting pictures in your city council meeting in your town, trust me, and I'm sure Mike knows the same. You can't do it in Mosul. You can't do it in Anbar. You can't do it in Ghazni. It's impossible. So like, try to figure out a way to work in the media, work in journalism, work in print journalism, and a newspaper is the best training ground for that. It's great. Also, if you want to go to the Missouri Photo Workshop, I can't more highly recommend it. Google it, MPW. They've been doing it for like 70 something years. I did it years ago. I learned more in that week than I've ever learned anywhere else in my life.
Good advice.
Reese from Missouri School of Journalism still runs it. It's an amazing experience. And apply for the Eddie Adams Workshop. I've been on the staff of the Eddie Adams Workshop for years. I know it's very selective. It's hard to get into, but keep applying, keep updating your portfolio and applying to the Eddie Adams Workshop. You're going to meet amazing people there. You're going to have incredible access to people in the industry who are going to move you forward. So those are just a couple quick tips. But yeah, it's a long slog. I mean, I've been doing this for how long? I've been doing this, Mike? 18 years.
Yeah.
And I was really seized with I was thinking about it, a couple weeks ago, and I was like, man, it feels like everything I ever did in my career was preparing me to be able to navigate this story, this situation,
Yeah. You did it. You got in the right place at the right time, and you did it. Much respect. Another question. Do you think the narrative of losing the war should be reframed as a failed nation building project?
I mean, I don't feel that way. I think that part of the problem with that is that you can't separate the two. And I know there's a real current in American politics that where nation building is like kind of a bad word. Part of our problem is that in the last 3 decades, probably we've kind of outsourced our role, our diplomatic and role in the world to the U.S. military, which is unfair to them. And it's unfair to the countries that we impose our military upon. So I don't think you can separate the two things. The nation building project failed, but so did our concept of war. Like our concept of special operations forces, of Navy SEAL teams, fast roping into villages, kicking down doors and killing people, of drone operators in Nevada, pushing a button and waiting 30 seconds to watch people be vaporized. That concept of war is what failed here. And that's a tough reckoning. People don't want to hear it, but that's how we fought this war. And that's why the Taliban won.
How do you see the next 6 months? We've got a question from someone. How do you see the next 6 months shaping up there? Do you feel like the Taliban will slowly consolidate, and that the peace will continue, and they'll push for recognition? And what are you saying?
Well, I will say that at least as far as Western journalists go, and as far as kind of Afghan society goes, I think we're definitely in the honeymoon period, right? We're definitely like, the Talibs are very busy trying to transition from an insurgency to a ruling party. I don't think it's clear yet. I don't think it's going to get a lot better. I think that they will probably take some cues from other authoritarian regimes in the region. I kind of tend to think they'll probably take some lessons from Iran, probably copy Iran a little bit about how they run their country. And then I do think they will moderate a little bit to try to gain international recognition, but they are very serious. They take very seriously. They want to build and what they call an Islamic system. They want to build an Islamic state. It'll be governed by Sharia law. That'll be interpreted by clerics, and it'll impact every aspect of Afghan people's lives. They will likely. The thing that I'm really curious about is the Talibs. Look, they've clearly moderated in certain ways, right? Like they haven't banned the internet. They're like very savvy users of social media, very savvy users of even broadcast media.
Different from the last time they were in power, when they banned music and they banned photography and no television.
Absolutely. So that's different, right? Thus far across the country, they've allowed young girls to study. We're still not sure about older girls and about university education for women, which is going to be a major problem. But even that was not on the table in the 90s. So they've clearly moderated in certain ways. But what's curious to me is, as they moderate in certain ways, what other ways are they going to moderate in? Like, so one of the things that is one of the great appeals of the Taliban to the Afghan citizens, especially in the countryside, is their at least perceived incorruptibility, right? Are they going to hold on to that, or will they succumb to the temptations of power, and will they become more corruptible? I tend to think they probably will. I tend to think that they are going to have a hard time holding the best aspects of their movement and letting go of some of the worst. I think that they're going to be moderated. So I think the next 6 months are going to be key. I hope to come back a couple of times and see how it goes. I think, but I don't think it's going to get any rosier for Afghan citizens. I think life under the Taliban is going to be circumscribed. It's going to be tough, and it's going to be very religiously conservative.
Two questions. I assume it's going to be, first off, I assume it's going to be a disaster for the gay community, LGBTQ community. And the other question is, well, anyway, can you just speak to that? Do you have any knowledge of what their policies are going to be? Have they talked about it?
I mean, look, for sure, the LGBTQ issues in this country it's a terrible climate for LGBTQ people. Like, people, it's just not a possibility to live as an out queer person in Afghanistan. It's very difficult. It's a society that is so divided, so repressed in so many ways anyway. And yet at the same time, it's a society that, like, where relationships between people of the same sex are much more fluid, much more sometimes I don't want to say open, because they're not open, but there's it's just a different kind of culture around those types of relationships. But look, clearly, like, out gay people are going to be persecuted here. There's no question about it. We were discussing today a rumor, and I don't know if it's true or not, that they had one of the classic punishments for homosexuality. And this was the discussion, is we weren't sure if it was actually a Sharia punishment or a kind of traditional punishment, is to, like, knock a wall over on the guilty as a form of execution. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be a disaster for LGBTQ people in Afghanistan. But let's be clear, that's always been the case. Like, under the previous government, you might not have been executed, but you were going to be repressed and maybe arrested for being an out gay person here. It's not like this place was a haven for LGBTQ people before the Taliban took over.
Sure. My other question, Vic, is, it's a huge country. It's I think the size of France or bigger. There's 35 million people, most people living under $2 a day. Do the Taliban actually have the expertise to run the country? Do they actually have engineers and civil servants, and do they know how to, set up and run a government and deliver services for the people?
Well, I mean, that's an amazing question. That's a super, super important question, and one that we're kind of trying to figure out. The answer is they have some.
On top of this, there must be a huge brain drain. People leaving for Pakistan, people leaving for the U.S.
Absolutely. And so far, the Talibs have really complained about this. The Talibs have really appealed to people's patriotism. They've really appealed to people to try to say, look, we need you to help run this country. We need you to develop Afghanistan and move it forward. We want to live in peace. We want to live in an Islamic system, but we want to live in peace. And we want to collaborate with, our countrymen to do that. And they're very concerned about the loss of doctors, of surgeons, of engineers, but at the same time, they're very intolerant about what beliefs you can have and still be able, they say that, and then they put together a government that is completely exclusive of anyone not inside their movement. So they're not exactly doing a good job of making their case right here. They're really failing in that regard. There are folks within the movement who are more capable, who have been preparing for this. The Talibs have had 20 years as well, and sometimes I'm surprised by how inept they seem. Like, right now, I'm like, man, you guys had 20 years. You guys couldn't get it together on this. And then sometimes I'm surprised at some of the things they have thought through. I think there's a real variance in capability and in the value of capability within the movement. I think that they are struggling hard. Like, look, the government that they announced is really exclusive. It's almost all Pashtun. It's almost all mullahs or religious scholars. No one from the previous government got a ministerial position. A few ethnic minorities did, but very few. It's not a good advertisement. It doesn't look good. And so, they've also made a call, and in some places they've tried to, it's funny, right? Because they want everybody to come back to work, because there's all these civil servants and stuff that work for the government that they need to come back and do their job so the government functions. So in some places they've put out like decrees, like demanding that people come back to work. And I'm thinking, okay, guys, like, read the room here. That's not the way to go about this. You're not going to get people to come back to work and feel comfortable if you're telling them they're going to get locked up if they don't. So what are you doing here? Right? It just doesn't make any sense. So, but at the same time, I think I'm not, one of the questions I've heard asked in this moment is, do the Taliban deserve a chance? Right? I think that's a really complicated, difficult question to answer. I'm not one that thinks the Taliban deserves a chance. I don't believe they deserve a chance. But at the same time, I don't think that we should undervalue the fact that the country's at peace. Someone asked, I think it was Laura asked a minute ago, how could I say the country's at peace when Afghan women are, their rights are circumscribed, which is true. But I would harken back to what I said a little earlier, that, not having the right to an education is fundamental, but as fundamental is having the right to have your family not evaporated in an artillery strike.
It would be nice if it wasn't one or the other.
Well, it would be nice. It would be nice, but the Talibs didn't make that choice. The Talibs didn't make that choice, right? The U.S. government made that choice. The U.S. military made that choice. That a level of what they call, and I hate this term, of collateral damage was acceptable in the overall project, and that collateral damage is what lost the war for them.
Those are people's families.
Yeah, like it was a huge. And it's not like it was just a recruiting tactic. It's like they had the project here, the U.S. project here, the Afghan government there was no loyalty to it, because it had fought and conducted itself so dishonorably for so long. Yeah. I think it's easy to underestimate how important peace is here. Yes,
for people who don't live through the nightly terror of raids and bombs falling. It's a pretty extraordinary thing to not have to worry about your kids being killed by a car bomb on the way to school in the morning. Yeah, no small thing. Vic, we're almost at the 1.5 hour mark, and I don't want to keep any longer. It must be, what is it, 3-4 o'clock in the morning there or something?
Yeah, it's going to be 4 soon here. Yeah, I took a nap, but yeah, we should get to what people want to, the last few things people want to talk about.
Me and you, we'll be here talking all night, and then the audience will be drifting off to sleep.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any other questions. And let me just check real quick in the chat. Last question? Let's make this the last question. Hold on one second. We have, this is from, I work for some years with government officials in Afghanistan. One colleague has mentioned the Taliban has announced that all mid-level to upper-level technical positions will be replaced by people within their movement. Right. It's very difficult to have an efficient government structure with such a lack of capacity. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's make this the last question from Laura. What's tomorrow like for you, Victor?
Well, tomorrow I'm going to get up. I'm going to work with a couple Afghan colleagues here I've been working with. We've been visiting and trying to talk to some Taliban units here in town. Kabul is kind of occupied by units from really kind of all over the country. One of the things people didn't really understand, it was hard for us to report on because it happened so quickly, was that, the Afghan government evaporated within hours, and the Taliban were caught off guard. The Taliban were in good faith waiting at the edges of the city and expected a negotiated handover to a transitional government. They did not expect to seize the reins of power the way they did. But when Ashraf Ghani, the former Afghan president, boarded his helicopter and left the presidential palace on August 15th, that was a signal to the entire Afghan government to drop their arms, drop what they were doing, and run. The Taliban had to come in and fill in that both government and security infrastructure. So there's folks from all over town, all over the country who've been here, and we're trying to talk to some of them and let them understand exactly what we want to do and try and cover some of these guys, see what their life is like in this. It'd be kind of like if you were from, you know, if
California.
you were, or no, if you were from small town, if you were from, you know, Apex, North Carolina, and you'd never been to Times Square, and all of a sudden you drove into Times Square and somebody was like, okay, guys, we need you to secure all of Hell's Kitchen. And you were like, oh man, like, you know, these guys are a little bit wide-eyed. They're a little bit like, what are we doing here? So I'm gonna visit one of these units, I hope tomorrow, and try to, you know, everything here is very top down. So you got to talk to somebody's commander and somebody's commander and somebody's commander.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to try to, I have another story about women and women's rights brewing that I'm going to try to deal with tomorrow. And then I have to do an interview and a portrait tomorrow for a series we're doing on the October 7th anniversary of the 20-year anniversary of the start of the war here. So yeah, I have a lot of stuff to do tomorrow.
Wow, it's going to be a busy day for you.
It will be a busy day. I appreciate it. I have some slow days too. We have like, I've definitely had days where I've like gone out to report stuff and gotten skunked, and you get home with no photos and you're like, wait, what did I do today? This was a total waste of time. And then, but you have to have those days. So you have other days where you get stuff done.
Right. One of the things that comes out, I don't want to get too much into this, but what's extraordinary, listening to you and working with you is that you're not just a photographer, you're a journalist. You understand the issues, you do the research. You can write when you have to, and you know how to put things together and understand what you're doing. You're not just out there clicking a shutter. And you carry on in a great tradition of great photographers who care. I want to thank you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to thank you. I know you've been working all over the world for a lot of years, and we want to make sure you stay safe and keep at it. So please be careful.
Yeah, no, we're being careful for sure. And it's interesting what you said. It's interesting. Like, I think that, nearly all of the photographers I know here, right? Like Marcus at LA Times showed up and was writing stories. Like Quilty's been writing stories. Jim's been writing stories. I saw that my AP colleagues, the amazing Felipe Dana and Bernat Armangue, they've been writing stories. Like, one of the things that always frustrates me is when I hear photographers talk about, I'm a visual person, I'm not a word person. It's like, all right, that's cool, man. But sometimes like events overtake that. Like that distinction just makes no difference right now. Like we have to do both. We have to do all this. And also, if it wasn't for my colleagues, Matt Akins and Jim and all the New York Times editors and the Wall Street Journal editors I worked with before that, and the Wall Street Journal reporters I worked before that, like none of this would, none of the coverage would be happening. We'd have even less of an idea what was going on, especially because there was no access to the evacuation on behalf of the U.S. military. That's something we didn't really talk about. I was so surprised. Actually, I can't say I was surprised by that. I mean, I asked day in, day out. I was in touch directly with officers. I mean, honestly, I think that the U.S. military ought to be ashamed. They should be ashamed of themselves. All the pictures we saw were handout photos shot by very brave, very committed combat camera folks. Like, I really respect those folks, but it's not the same thing as independent journalism. And they created a disaster and they didn't let anybody go photograph it, which I thought was very frustrating. But no, like all my colleagues here is, we all help each other out. We all look out for each other. We all collaborate. If, we compete, but we're not competitive, without all them, none of this would be happening. So.
Yeah. Much respect to all of them. And let's not forget, we've got a list of names and photos on our wall here. I think there's more than 50 journalists who died, Afghan and foreign journalists who died covering that war. And
absolutely,
we don't forget that.
They're absolutely, those names, those folks, they made photographs that not only create our visual, our memory, our historical memory of Afghanistan, but that like we as photographers learn from, right? The great Shah Mirai, Dave Gilkey, who, I knew here and ran around with, Dinesh most recently, it's been heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for me that, again, like with Dinesh, that those folks haven't been able to be here to see like the culmination, the end of this project. It's tough.
Yeah. You got a shout out from Jennifer Wolford, and LJB is said thanks for sharing this with the world, and you're amazing. So we'll leave it there. Victor, thank you so much. Thank you, brother.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night. Talk to you soon.
All right. Stay well.
All right.
Thank you to the audience. Thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you guys for tuning in. Yeah, appreciate it. Okay.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.